Okay, everyone, welcome to another New Jersey Constitutional Republican virtual conversation. It's my great privilege today to have our great friend, Professor John Schaff from Northern University in beautiful South Dakota. Professor, great to have you back.
And great to be with you again, everyone who watches this. It's an honor.
And of course, we've done, I believe we've done 5 previous Professor, and we're doing a deep dive into your book. I want to put that up for the people to see. And I want to let people know, Professor, that your book is going up in price. So people need to get out there now and purchase this book as soon as possible. It's called Abraham Lincoln's Statesmanship and the Limits of Liberal Democracy. And we've been doing a deep dive into this, and constitutional Republicans throughout the country are going to want to buy this book. It's a fantastic look at Lincoln. Of course, Professor, you're aware that we want to restore the Republican Party back into Abraham Lincoln's image. And this book goes a long way in helping to accomplish that task. And we're really appreciative of you writing this book and then sharing it with us in such in depth as we are.
Absolutely.
And we're going to talk about chapter 3 today, Professor, which is Lincoln's political economy in the American tradition. Now, last time we talked about Lincoln's appeal to the natural rights theory and understanding. And today we're going to talk about America's political economy, the American tradition, which is chapter 3. And Professor, you start out in the chapter. I think it's very interesting that you make the comparison between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, and how Lincoln basically took the best attributes of both of those important gentlemen and basically made it a part of his political theory.
Yeah, this is one of my own pet theories, so to speak, is that, and I think I'll be writing about this more in the future, is that I see Lincoln as a synthesis between Jeffersonianism and Hamiltonianism. And maybe just to explain that in a little thumbnail sketch for people maybe aren't as familiar with these debates of the American founding. At the time of the American founding, if we were talking about political economy, you would have found people, generally speaking, in one of 2 camps. That would be one of the Jeffersonians and the other the Hamiltonians. And Jefferson's basic view was that the economy of America should be based on agriculture. It should be an agrarian society. He thought that the idea that people were self-sufficient, living on their own, off the land, being able to provide for their own daily bread, so to speak, and that was the key to being a free person. Is that's what independence meant. That's what economic liberty meant. Is that you're not dependent upon other people, and so to that extent, Jefferson was not fond of banking and finance because he saw it as making money without producing anything valuable. And he was also opposed to America being a manufacturing nation because he thought that, in short, I'm doing a little bit of injustice to Jefferson, but in short, that when you get involved in industry and manufacturing, you're dependent upon the consumer, and you have to do things like advertise and public relations, and you have to give in to consumer demand, and so you're not really at liberty. You're at you're a slave, you might say, to the market, and he didn't like that. Whereas if you're just simply growing food for yourself and maybe just a little bit extra to sell, just leave it at that. Now Hamilton's view was different. Part of the Jeffersonian view is the idea that wealth comes from ownership of land. That's why Jefferson thought America's great. We've got all this land. Remember, as president, he does the Louisiana Purchase. So we got all this land, so Americans can go out and they've got lots of places to farm, and this is going to be the basis of a free society. But Hamilton, more kind of in the lines of Adam Smith, thought that no, wealth comes from being productive, and being productive means that you have to manufacture, you have to finance, And also, it's as simple as this. Not everybody either wants nor has the talent to be a farmer. And people with those skills or those interests need to have outlets. And so we have to have, if we think, go back to the Washington administration, and I go through this a little bit in the book, but Hamilton's famous report on manufacturers, the whole idea there is that, agriculture is great, but if we've got a diversity of talents, we need to give people more outlets for their interests and their talents. And therefore, he said, we need to have banking to stimulate different kinds of productivity. We need to do things like what today we would call infrastructure. The federal government should be doing things like building roads, building bridges, improving rivers and harbors, these sorts of things. And this takes some kind of government activity, including, for example, creating a Bank of the United States, as we did under the Washington administration. Much to the joy of Alexander Hamilton and much to the consternation of Thomas Jefferson, we created the first Bank of the United States in the Washington administration. And we can get into maybe the upshot, I think, is that Lincoln is more Hamiltonian than maybe sometimes people think. Though there's an element of Jeffersonianism that we can get into, if not today, maybe next time. That I think is there, and that's more of his concept of free labor, which we may or may not get to today.
Right, and also what's interesting, Professor, is the fact that we associate the ideas of state sovereignty, states' rights versus a strong federal government. Of course, Hamilton was a proponent of a stronger federal government, and Jefferson, of course, was a proponent of the states' rights. So, along with the economic theory, but you tie into the book the fact that Lincoln identifies with Jefferson, especially with Lincoln's adoration for the Declaration of Independence. And the principles of the equality, self-evident truth that all men are created equal. He built upon that, but without a question, Lincoln was very Whiggish, if you will, with the American system, and of course Henry Clay, as you talk about in the book. And so that's really what we see in that respect, as far as the, and of course what I thought was very interesting is you talk about in this chapter, of course, you're showing really the history of the Whig Party, where it came from, why it came about. And it was a result really of one Andrew Jackson.
Yeah. Well, there's, I'm trying to think, it's in the book. I can't remember who it was. There was a scholar who called Henry Clay's American system the lineal descendant of Hamilton's report on manufacturers. I'm trying to think if that was John Patrick Diggins or who it was who said that. Because you've
I'll
got
find it for you. Hold on.
JR's going to find it for me. I thought I've got the book right here, but I wasn't going to bother looking at it.
No, don't worry about it.
Find it. I think it's in the first page or two of the chapter, but I just can't remember.
Yeah, it is. It's early on. I just wrote it a little while ago.
Yeah. Who was that said that?
John Patrick Diggins.
It was John Patrick Diggins. All right, so I was right, and I doubted myself, and I needed JR to back me up. But so you've got in Hamilton, right? If you just look at that Washington administration, you have things like I talk about the report on manufacturers. You've got the report on public credit, why the federal government has to take on the debts of states. You've got the creation of the Bank of the United States. You can see even when Hamilton is writing his Publius in the Federalist Papers, that he's in favor of, I would call it a vigorous federal government, which is not the same as an unlimited government. As he says in Federalist 23, where the ends are legitimate, the means are assumed, right? But government is a government of just government has limited ends. Now, the means to achieve those ends might be unlimited in that we can't anticipate everything that government's ever going to have to do. The limit is on the ends of government, but nonetheless, compared to the Articles of Confederation, or as you say, compared to Thomas Jefferson, who's for a stronger, more vigorous federal government. And also you can see in the programs I'm talking about is the government taking some action to promote economic activity, then you leap forward about, I don't know, about 35, 40 years, and the rise of the Whig Party, which is a reaction to Andrew Jackson. And part of it was the way that Jackson was using the presidency, that they thought Jackson was too strong in the use of the powers of the presidency. Of course, Hamilton was all pro-presidency, so that's not the dissent from Hamilton for the Whigs. But it said also Jackson had inherited from Jefferson this very strict construction of the Constitution, that if it's not literally in the Constitution, the federal government can't do it. So the government can't do anything for roads. It can't do anything. And he didn't, obviously he really hated the National Bank, so much so that he shut it down and defied court orders on that. And didn't want any what they called internal improvements, was the kind of the catch-all language of rivers, harbors, roads, bridges, these sorts of things, and didn't want the federal government involved in this anyway. And then Henry Clay had devised this thing that he called the American system, which was kind of a series of proposals to do everything Jackson didn't want to do. And the idea is that economic activity will tie this growing country. I think by the time we get to, we're talking about the 1830s basically here. You've got states out to Illinois, Indiana, Michigan. The government owns everything up to the Mississippi River, because you got in the Missouri River, because you got the obviously Louisiana Purchase, as we said, under Jefferson. So Clay's thinking, how do we tie this all together? And one of the ways we tie it all together is if we are doing business with each other. It ties the country together, and that's what makes it the American system. And we've probably mentioned before, but if not, we'll mention again that in Abraham Lincoln's famous eulogy in 1852, I believe, to Henry Clay, he said that Henry Clay was my beau ideal of a statesman. And Lincoln's economics is basically Whig, WHIG, the Whig Party, Henry Clay economics. And you see that going all the way back to when he was a member of the legislature in Illinois, of backing road projects, canal projects, these sorts of things. So very much, I think you can draw a line. I don't know it's a straight line, but it's a pretty straight line. Hamilton, Clay, Lincoln, with these Jeffersonian exceptions that maybe we can get to in a little bit. Talking about free labor.
Right, Professor. We both have to stand corrected, and I'm going to read from the book. It says, yet many scholars draw a connection between the Whig Party, Lincoln, and Alexander Hamilton. Prominent Whig Henry Clay's American system of economics is called by Harry Jaffa.
That's Jaffa.
The infamous Harry Jaffa. The linear, quote, the linear descent, unquote, of Hamilton's report on manufactures. Further, Lincoln's policies were rooted in Hamilton and Clay's American system, writes Stephen F. Knott. Now, John Patrick Diggins remarks that unlike Jefferson's romantic defense of the agrarian life, Lincoln could not wait to flee the farm, which is true, that provided no future or advancement. And of course, we were talking about Joshua Claiborne earlier, we had on a couple of weeks ago, and he wrote a book called Abe's Youth. He's from Southern Indiana, and he talked about and can back up your statement here of Lincoln's loathing of working agrarian labor. And of course, Lincoln became a lawyer, or became a self-educated lawyer and brilliant.
Well, I won't make you look this one up, but I think it was Mark Neely who said that Lincoln did not have it's either agrarian or pastoral bone in his body.
Yes, pastoral. Lincoln, that's the word you use.
Yeah, growing up.
That's the word right here.
Because of course, he was really young when they left Kentucky. I should probably know this date off the top of my head, but he was maybe 3-4 years old. When they left
7
Kentucky.
to 20. Yeah, 7 to 21. He was in Indiana.
Yeah. Okay. So 7. All right. So it was a little bit later, right? And they went up to Southern Indiana, and one of the things his father would do was loan Lincoln out to local farmers. And so Lincoln would work as a farmhand as a boy and a teenager. And then his dad would take the money. They would pay Lincoln, but then his dad would take the money. And Lincoln, Freud would love Lincoln because I think Lincoln had some dad issues, because by all accounts, his father was a bit of a pill, you might say. Lincoln didn't even go to his father's funeral. They had some issues. Let's just put it that way. But part of it, his bitterness of, he didn't really like doing farm work. And even though we know, as a young man, it's not like he was afraid of manual labor. Because he worked on riverboats. And he did do, it wasn't exactly the rail splitter of lore, but he did that kind of work. And it's not like he didn't, but the guy was meant for something else. And that's part of what drives Lincoln into the Whig Hamiltonian camp, is that Lincoln looks at himself and says, well, I don't want to be a farmer. The Jeffersonian ideal has nothing to offer me. My talents are elsewhere. Here's a guy who obviously figured out as a young age, I'm pretty smart. I like to read. I like to solve problems. I like to debate. Now, what am I going to do? And so, of course, he had some odd jobs. He ended up being a shopkeeper for a while, that sort of thing. But eventually he said, no, the law is really for me, because I like talking, I like reading, I like making arguments. The law is for me. And so we need an economy that has enough different industry and occupations for people of various skills and various interests to find something that they can make a living. And that's what's going to make them independent.
I also thought too, Professor, it's interesting in the first chapter that although Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were always considered adversaries on the on one side of the spectrum or the other, we have identified two areas. But the one area that they did agree on was the inefficiency of the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah.
And that's why they both agreed on the calling of the Constitutional Convention to draw up the Constitution. That's something that should also
Absolutely.
Be remembered.
Neither one of them was 100% happy with the Constitution. And in the obvious directions, Hamilton sometimes thought the Constitution wasn't quite strong enough. Jefferson at times thought it was a little bit too strong, but they both it's hard to find someone to defend the Articles of Confederation, frankly, by 1787. Because even those who became the Anti-Federalists pretty much agreed that some adjustments had to be made, because it was such an obviously weak government and insufficient to do the things government needed to do. And even Jefferson, who was a pretty small government states' rights guy, saw that the uber states' rights notion that undergirded the Articles of Confederation was never going to work, as well as not having a strong executive. Lincoln had seen that. Jefferson had seen that in Virginia when he was governor, that having a government totally dominated by the legislature didn't work. You needed some sort of independent source of power for the presidency. And even, and in fact, in practice, Jefferson acted very strong as president, and in a way that I think would have made Alexander Hamilton happy if Hamilton didn't always buy. I mean, Hamilton died at right before the 1804 election, that July, of course, July of 1804. So he didn't live to see the second term, which he might have not have liked as much, the second term of Jefferson, with the shenanigans with the British and the French. But Jefferson was a strong president, and I think Hamilton would have liked that.
Right. As you, of course, the beginning of this chapter, talking about what we're discussing with the difference between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, how Lincoln was able to benefit from both, and how Alexander Hamilton really essentially was the economic basis. His theories were the economic basis for the creation of the Whig Party, and taken up by Henry Clay. And then you move into a very, very interesting part of the chapter, Professor, and you talk about Lincoln as a precursor to the progressive movement.
Yeah.
And how many progressives have attempted to identify Lincoln, and maybe in some circumstances, rightfully so. But at the end, you make clear distinction. First of all, you do a great job in the chapter of defining progressivism from the words right out of the mouth of its biggest advocate, presidential advocate, Woodrow Wilson, and then also its ideological advocate, Herbert Crowley.
Mm-hmm.
So you clearly make the case for the progressive movement and how some of that may have been attributed to Lincoln, but not so much so because as you make known, and what I want you to flesh out are some of the characteristics of progressivism that we could associate with Lincoln, but the ones that we certainly cannot associate with Lincoln.
Yeah, and what I do in the book is, when I'm talking, we got to go back, 110 years or so, and to the founding or the formation of progressive, progressive with a capital P, the progressive movement, to the extent that, of course, you had a progressive party there for a while, which essentially, when Teddy Roosevelt runs for president, runs for a non-consecutive third term, the Bull Moose Party was the Progressive Party. That's where he ran. So we're looking at people like Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson. You mentioned Herbert Crowley, who is the founder of the New Republic magazine, which is still extant today, although only in online form anymore. And Crowley, most people think actually wrote Teddy Roosevelt's famous New Nationalism speech. It was written by Herbert Crowley, and Crowley has this. He wrote a couple big books, but one of them is called Progressive Democracy. And then I think you could throw, even though this is a little bit later, you could throw FDR into that as well if people are curious. Look at Roosevelt's Commonwealth Club address of 1932 when he was running for president, and it's a very academically, I mean, progressive with a capital P, it's a very progressive interpretation of American history. And what the progressives were arguing about, what's the base of this? And this is going to make a certain amount of sense, is they say, America was founded in this age where we're basically a rural, agricultural, agrarian people. It was a Jeffersonian dream. But then, what had happened by the time, let's pick 1910 as a date. In that late 19th century, we'd seen the sea change in the American economy. And then this is, industrialism comes to America right after the Civil War, about 80 to 100 years later than it did in Great Britain. So you get the rise of these national corporations. And so you start to see the decline of farming as a percentage of the population. You start to see the, people moving to cities. So things like, people aren't working for themselves anymore. They're sort of working for the man. They're working in a factory, and they're earning a wage, right? They're wage laborers now. And things like, I'm not growing my own food. I buy my food at the store. This is different than, I don't make my own clothes. I buy my clothes at the store. This is a very different economy than the self-sufficient agrarian economy of Jefferson. So they say, well, maybe with this change in economy, we need these changes in policy. We need things like, regulation of corporations. We need minimum wage law, work week law, child labor law, food safety law, all sorts of things. And they're sort of grumpy about the U.S. Constitution. And so they've got this theory. I guess, briefly, especially if you look at Woodrow Wilson, who, of course, our only political scientist to ever be president. And judging by his presidency, may there never be another one. But he had Wilson was a PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins. He wrote a couple major works on the U.S. Constitution, including one right before he became president. He wrote a book simply called the Constitutional Government in the United States. And basically, I think you could say progressives believe this. There's a principled argument in favor of what we call historicism. Historicism believes that truth is defined by your place in history. right? So each place in history kind of has its own way of looking at the world. Think of history as a line, and where you are in that line, that determines how you view the world and what truth is. And by virtue of living later in history than the founders, the progressives assumed we know more than the founders, we've learned things, and therefore we don't need to be bound by the founders' ideals, and their political science no longer works in the world of the early 20th century. And so there's kind of a principled rejection of the political science of the founders, even that the founding would have anything to teach us. And part of that then is there's a principled rejection of natural rights. Wilson says that the natural rights parts of the Declaration of Independence are the least part of the Declaration of Independence. Why? Because natural rights limit, and progressives really didn't like limits. Anything that would limit government is bad, and natural rights suggests that there's a limit, that government can't do whatever it wants to do. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So natural rights are out. Constitutionalism is out. Wilson invented the term, the living Constitution. When he says the Constitution is not a Newtonian, as in Isaac Newton. It's not a mechanical thing. Think of your laws of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. That's sort of the theory of separation of powers. And Wilson says, no, it's more Darwinian. It's a living thing. It's organic, not mechanical. Therefore, each generation needs to interpret it as it wants to. We don't want limits of the law. And that's because, I don't know where I am now, third or fourth thing, wherever I am on my list now, is progressives believed in scientific government. Again, Wilson is a PhD in political science. He's a former political science professor, university president at Princeton. He's also founder of the field of today, what we call public administration. So he said, we've got these social scientists who know all sorts of things about how to arrange societies so we can have a good society. We can scientifically arrange society to make it the best society possible. Why would we tie ourselves down with things like laws and constitutions and natural rights when society is this experiment, and you let the scientist experiment and use his knowledge. I mean, if you think of this term we've heard a lot over the last year or so, follow the science. Maybe there's some truth to that when it's a medical science, but here we're talking about social science. And Wilson believes that bureaucrats schooled in fields of political science and public administration should be the ones that actually manage society in the name of the people. So there's going to be elections. We're going to elect people to office, but the actual running of the government needs to be put in the hand of these professionals. And you don't want to tie these professionals down by putting up laws and constitutions. So there is in progressivism a principled rejection of limited government. And that's something that I think separates the progressives from almost everybody of the founding, including both Jefferson and Hamilton. Is even, like I was saying, Hamilton believes in a stronger government, but he doesn't believe in an unlimited government. And I think you can find that in these early progressives. And so my argument, even though all these progressives, even relatively contemporary progressives, I've got some quotes in there from George McGovern from my own state here of South Dakota, the former governor of New York, Mario Cuomo, who, of course, whose son is currently the governor of New York. They both McGovern and Cuomo wrote books about Lincoln in the early 2000s, about 15, 20 years ago. They both wrote books on Lincoln, and both say that Lincoln would be this progressive guy, and I just don't think that's true, because I think when you look at Lincoln, I think it's pretty clear that Lincoln is a believer, obviously, in natural rights, which we talked about at length last time. I don't think we need to belabor that, but also in limited government. And we can talk about that for a little bit if you'd like.
Right, and the other aspect of progressivism, which we see today, which we've seen ever since FDR, is that strong centralized
Yeah.
power attributed to the executive branch, and the way that crises are exploited to further
Yeah.
extend and make greater authoritative power to the presidential branch. Of course, now we think of the president as being the leader of the country, and that he has a mandate that he has to fulfill, and that he's the spokesman for the country. And of course, we've seen this even with Republican presidents and with the Trump administration. This strong idea that the authority, the executive branch, has to guide and direct the means and the way, as opposed to having all the branches of government working equally,
Yeah.
with really the Congress setting the agenda, which is more what the Whigs and
Yep.
more what traditional Republicans would believe in. And the progressives say, or they think, that Lincoln was very powerful, but he was in a very, very unique situation where he was conducting a war
Yep.
with amongst the country, with the secession of the states. And it was never intended to last. The administrative powers that he took, or the commander in chief, the really, he was the general of the war, and he understood and he read up and learned about that. But that didn't mean that he believed. He still always would to defer to Congress, especially
Yep.
with the domestic policy, as you talk about here in the
Yep.
book. He didn't continue. He didn't continue that imperialist type or that prime ministerial type office that
Yep.
Wilson and the progressives and that FDR really considered the presidency to be, and for all that matter, Trump as well.
Yep. Well, I think a couple points to make about Lincoln on this. First of all, one of the reasons that progressives like to look to Lincoln is that, obviously, he was a strong war leader. Then, as I think you're at least alluding to, if not outright saying it, there's a difference between war leadership and then peacetime leadership, and that's a
Yes.
problem. The Civil War is an actual, honest to goodness crisis, but we do have a problem in our day, is that we're always, there's a crisis under every rock, and there's a former professor of mine once say, whenever they talk about crisis, hold on to your wallet. Some crises are real crises, but sometimes a crisis is simply announced because it's a way to compel people to do something.
Right.
So that there's that. But even as a non-war president,
Professor, let me just interrupt you while we're talking about this, because we've seen this past pandemic over the last year been identified as a war, and in that way, the governor, specifically here in New Jersey, and in all the other Democrat states, that essentially suspended the First Amendment rights of freedom of assembly, freedom of religious expression, and also the New Jersey Constitution gives the people the right to obtain, possess, and protect their property, which was all affected by the suspension of these constitutional rights in lieu of a supposed health crisis.
Yep.
And what we've been talking about, Professor, is the fact that we've had world wars, we've had a horrible civil war, we've had pandemics and epidemics before. We had an AIDS pandemic in New York in 1980, but yet we never suspended the Constitution until 2020.
Yeah.
And most of the people don't understand this, that their constitutional rights have been violated. And that's why it's so important that the executive branches, the governor and the presidency, work within the enumerated responsibilities. In our Constitution, it's Article 5, and the federal Constitution is Article 5, which gives the enumerated duties of the presidency. And incidentally, Professor, there's no mention of executive orders anywhere in the Constitution.
Well, there's, and I think you've seen this in a couple of the Supreme Court cases dealing mostly with religious liberty, where the court has said the Constitution is not suspended in times of pandemic or any kind of crisis. And whatever you think of the COVID crisis, and I don't mind calling it a crisis, but we also know that various governors and perhaps the federal government exploited the crisis as a reason to extend their own powers, maybe beyond what is necessary. It's sort of like, I remember, if you remember back in the wake of 9/11, if you wanted to get something out of the federal government, you just called it national defense. And so next thing you knew that, education policy was national defense and agriculture policy was, everyone just said, this is national defense. And then what we've seen in the last year is everything under the sun is public health. Or now we see this in the Biden administration. Apparently everything is infrastructure. It's hard to imagine what isn't. It'd be easier to say what is not infrastructure maybe at this point, because it seems like everything is infrastructure. We have an infrastructure crisis, and then this justifies all sorts of things. And that's why I say, in Lincoln, even though they were a very important piece of legislation, set aside the war, important piece of legislation passed during those Civil War Congress, and really almost all of them that first Congress, the 37th Congress, which goes from 1861 to 1863. And we'll talk about it because this is mostly the second half of the book. We'll probably talk about this at length some other time. But Homestead Act, Land Grant College Act, Pacific Railroad Act, there's a currency bill, a banking bill, the first income tax was during the Civil War. So people looked at those things, but if you look at that, a couple things. One, three of those things I just mentioned, Homestead, Land Grant College, Pacific Railroad, are land bills. It's actually the outcome of that legislation was the federal government giving away power. We've got this land that we own, and we're going to give it away for colleges. We're going to give it away to sell at a very low rate to homesteaders. We're going to set this aside for railroads, right? So the government wasn't gaining any power. In fact, they were giving power away. And even though the federal government grew during the Civil War, as is typical, as they say, war is the health of the state. By like 1870, and the numbers are in the book, I took them from Alan Guelzo, I don't remember them off the top of my head, but basically by 1870, 1872, the federal government was not quite at the size as it was before the Civil War, but almost. All the growth during the Civil War had disappeared within 5 to 6 years after where almost all that growth was gone. Whether it's, you measure that in dollars spent, departments and bureaus, government employees had almost all returned to pre-war levels. And then, as you say, Lincoln was largely deferential to Congress on these things. Congress drove the bus on almost all this legislation, especially the land legislation, was almost all created by Congress. And in Lincoln's respect for the rule of law, we talked about months ago when we first talked about prudence and moderation, the Lyceum speech of 1838. Lincoln's dedication to the rule of law is famous. And even you see this as president, even on war type things where you think he'd be the strongest, when he says to Horace Greeley that I don't know that it's in my power to simply emancipate all the slaves, right? I'm constrained by the Constitution, and I have my personal beliefs, but I have to follow the law. When he did end up emancipating the slaves, on January 1, 1863, it was only in those parts of the country that were in rebellion at that time, which means, for example, Missouri, Delaware, Kentucky, and what am I forgetting, Maryland, the border states, the slave states that stayed within the Union, and even various parts of Virginia and like Louisiana that were currently under Union occupation. The Emancipation Proclamation did not pertain to them. And because Lincoln said, this is a war measure, I can't use a war measure against places that aren't at war with the federal government. And when Salmon Chase, his very abolitionist Secretary of Treasury, chided him for it, Lincoln said, on what grounds could I extend the proclamation? I would be on the field of lawlessness. This would be tyranny if I just simply did whatever I wanted outside the law. In fact, that's the very definition of tyranny, is acting on your own will instead of within the process of the law. And so Lincoln had, where his differences with the progressives. He believed in natural rights. We've talked about that in a different webcast, so we don't have to belabor that. Strong dedication to the U.S. Constitution and the rule of law, and also he did not elevate presidential power the way progressives did. There's this famous passage, maybe infamous passage from Woodrow Wilson's book, Constitutional Government, which is like written in like 1909 or 1910, where he says, the people crave a single leader. When the people are united behind one man, right, nothing can resist him. And Wilson thinks this is a good thing, right? When the right man, captures the spirit of the people, he's irresistible. And I say,
Professor.
Yeah, go ahead.
Professor, isn't that precisely what we saw with the last administration?
Well, I think it's what we've seen with almost every administration in some way, shape, or form. Probably since
since FDR.
Yeah, and I think you can make an
FDR.
exception to that. Eisenhower might be an exception to that, and various presidents on various issues.
Maybe Nixon even too.
But the presidential center of our politics, I think, skews. And again, I'm relatively Hamiltonian on these things. I like I think a strong presidency, a strong executive is necessary, but there are points, the pendulum can swing too far in the other direction. And what has happened probably in our time is that when you see the rise of presidential power, is that sometimes Congress then does not fulfill its responsibilities because they simply wait for the executive to dictate to them, or the presidency to dictate to us, as you're talking about with executive orders, that we simply, we'll let the executive, well, famously in the Affordable Care Act, AKA Obamacare, there are over 100 instances in that almost 1,000-page piece of legislation where it says, as defined by the secretary, and that usually means the Secretary of Health and Human Services, to the extent that when Congress, after the Affordable Care Act is put into law, Congress had to go to the Secretary of Health and Human Services to find out whether Congress was covered by the bill. So the people who wrote the bill didn't know whether they were covered or not, and it was up to the discretion of the executive branch to tell Congress whether Congress's own bill covered Congress. And that might be a little bit too much deference to, even though I believe in executive power. There's
really,
a point
was
where you've delegated too much.
And it was FDR really where this all started to become. Wilson wanted to do it, but FDR was really the one who.
Well, yeah, it's theoretical.
Act
Wilson,
out this strong.
Let
me read a portion of the book towards the end, because I want to move into the last part. But you write that I argued above the three important features of progressive political thought are advocacy of a robust, even unlimited national government, a strong and largely unbounded presidency, and a drastic reinterpretation of the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in order to achieve these goals. I have tried to show that Lincoln's political philosophy does not conform to the progressive vision. And this is interesting that you had Joseph Forneri argues that for Lincoln, progress, quote unquote, was measured against a standard. And that standard was the Declaration of Independence, which is what the progressives reject.
Everybody, the attractiveness of progressivism is partially in the name, because who's opposed to progress? Everybody likes progress. The thing is, though, is that to know whether you're progressing or not, you have to know which direction you're heading. So if you want to go up to New York City, JR, you better know where New York City is. Otherwise, you don't know whether you're progressing in your direction. If you're heading south, you're going the wrong direction. So you need to have a roadmap. You need to have someplace you're heading. And in the American system, that's defined by where we're heading is are the principles of the Declaration. The roadmap is the Constitution. Right? So Lincoln's great line about the Declaration. He's borrowing this from the Book of Proverbs, that the Declaration is the apple of gold, the Constitution is a frame of silver.
Frame of silver.
yeah, that surrounds it,
Constitution,
right?
protecting the Declaration
And so you need
and
to know where
displaying
you're.
the Declaration.
Yep, exactly. And so you need to know where you're going. So one of the analogy or the tool I use in the book is, this is going to sound a little bit academic hoity-toity here for a second. There is in some theologians, when they talk about change in religion, they use the phrase the hermeneutic of continuity. All right, that's just fancy talk that says as you are progressing, there's got to be some kind of continuity, right? There's something that you hearken back to know as you change that it actually is progress, because not all change is progress, right? And not all progress is in the forward direction. If I can quote C.S. Lewis, if you're going in the wrong direction, progress means turn around and go back. You're actually getting closer to your goal if you're going in the wrong direction. And so, and sometimes like in religious circumstance, you'd say things like scripture, whatever the holy book of the religion is, or like in Christianity, they talk about the early church fathers are, what we're doing is it in continuity with that. In the American political context, when we have change, it is within the context of continuity with the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution. And that's how we know that we can make the distinction between actual change and what is merely change and what is actual progress. And so if you just throw out the idea of the natural rights founding in the Declaration, and you throw out the US Constitution, again, central to the US Constitution is the idea of separation of powers. And Woodrow Wilson wrote, no successful government has ever been formed out of antagonisms, right? There's a principled rejection of separation of powers in Woodrow Wilson. He doesn't like it. He always believed in centralization of power. As a young political scientist, he believed that centralization should be in Congress. As an older political scientist, he thought that centralization should be in the US presidency, as we've been talking about. And Lincoln rejects all these things. He believes in limited constitutional government. He believes in natural rights. He had a more modest conception of the United States presidency, where the strength that is built into the presidency only comes out during times of real crisis, like a civil war. That in ordinary time, Congress should be driving policy, and the president's powers come about under more extraordinary circumstances. And so I don't think you can draw a line between Lincoln and the progressive movement of the early 20th century.
Right. And I think too, Professor, it's important. I want to move on to the last part, but in saying that, the people don't realize, many people don't understand the important role that a Thaddeus Stevens played in the House of Representatives, and then a Charles Sumner played in the Senate. These men were very, very predominant. They were very, very high profile, and Lincoln let them do their work. He didn't feel threatened by them. And of course, they were considered radical Republicans, and Lincoln was more of a moderate. But he understood the great work that Thaddeus Stevens was doing and that Charles Sumner were doing. But there's an example of a congressman and a senator who were very much very prominent in the way in which government worked during the Civil War, and really essentially worked that way up until really the progressive era, or the presidency of FDR. But anyway, Professor, I want to talk about what I think is very interesting, and you're going to have to flesh this out a little bit. But the two headings are Crown Kings, Money Kings, and Land Kings, Lincoln and free labor, and this very interesting concept of distributism.
Distributism.
And explaining that.
Well, let's focus on Lincoln. I don't want to get too bogged down in distributism. What I'm trying to argue in this last section of the chapter on Lincoln's political economy is this is within Catholic social teaching, sort of, let's say it's a cousin to it. It's not like it's doctrine or anything. But in the late 19th, early 20th century, there's this economic theory that arises sort of out of Catholic social thought called distributism. And basically what distributism says is that a just economy is one where productive property is distributed, so what we would call capital, is distributed in as many hands as possible. That's the name distributism. So this is either things like small shops, small farms, things like maybe employee participation in governance of a company, or employee ownership of a company.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you go back to Lincoln, Lincoln had this theory of free labor. And I think that free labor theory is not, as I say, it's not in total harmony with distributism, but it's got some remarkable similarities. And it's basically this, which is that Lincoln makes a distinction. You can find this in his famous Wisconsin agricultural address. And I got to think dates here, 1859. And even in his first message to Congress at the end, there's this kind of strange digression that he goes on where he talks about the same thing. Basically, Lincoln says there are three different kinds of labor. There's slave labor, wage labor, and free labor. Slave labor probably needs no definition here, right? And obviously Lincoln thinks it's unjust. Then there's wage labor. Wage labor is where you work for somebody else, right? And so you're a laborer and someone else owns your labor. And he calls that wage labor. And then there's free labor. And free labor is when you work for yourself. We would call that probably in our day, probably an entrepreneur or a small business owner, a proprietor, something like that. And Lincoln, he thinks wage labor is superior to slave labor. There's no doubt about that. But he also thinks that wage labor is not the same as free labor. And this is what we're talking about at the beginning. This is, I think, Lincoln imbibing a little bit of Jeffersonianism. Even though Lincoln does not believe in that everyone should be a farmer, he does not believe in agrarian America. He does think, his argument towards free labor is similar to why Jefferson thought that agrarian society should be the best, that people should provide for themselves and own their own labor. So when I get up in the morning and I go to work, the boss is me. And so I partake in both things. I'm both a capitalist and I'm the laborer at the same time. So he says that the natural progression should be that people might start as a wage laborer, as Lincoln himself did, when we're talking about some of the odd jobs that he had as a young man, right? He was a wage laborer, but then he used that experience and those skills to become a free laborer, which certainly by the time he became a lawyer, he was a free laborer, right? He had his own law firm, he had his own law practice, and I put it this way, you can see, like, we'll use a farming example. And I'm out here, I'm in farm country. Everyone around me is a farmer. They're all over the place. And this is what Lincoln means, is that the farmer gets up every day and he decides what he's going to do. And we all know, there are always constraints, just like any small business owner, right? Like, especially when farming, the weather dictates some of it. What time of year dictates some of it. If the fence is broke, the fence has got to be fixed. Maybe that day, if your cattle are getting out, right? You got to do it. But on the whole, the farmer wakes up in the morning and he says, this is what I'm going to do today, right? And to Lincoln, this is free labor because no one is dictating to you what you're doing. And you get to participate both in, like I say, in both labor, but also in capital. And that's what makes a free person. And so he thinks this is going to be more productive. When you work for yourself, when you get the fruits of your labor, you're going to work harder, you're going to be more productive. And that's why he says that the people that can be more productive and develop these habits of kind of I'll just call the entrepreneur, they will be free. This is where the title of the section, the chapter comes from. They'll be free of land kings, money kings, and crown kings. that you have to
Right.
develop these habits. And this is very Jeffersonian. If you have these habits of independence, as opposed to being, when I'm a wage laborer, I am dependent on someone else for my money. I'm dependent
Yes.
on someone to tell me what to do when I come to work each day. In most circumstances, obviously there's
Yes.
spectrum there. Um,
Yep.
but part of being a free person and a free citizen is that you own your own labor. And so to the extent possible, and to a certain extent, the bird has flown on this. We are a nation of wage laborers. But to the extent possible, we should make it as easy to for people to become entrepreneurs, or I say maybe if have workers at least participate somewhat in the governance, or maybe things like profit sharing or employee ownership, that sort of thing, as you see in some companies. That this would develop the habits, some of those habits that are necessary for a free citizenry. So I think that's probably the upshot of Lincoln on free labor. So we might think today of things like, I was just talking to some people about this the other day. This is my own view, so people can take this for what it's worth. I think most licensing requirements are absurd. The fact that the person who cuts my hair, what's left of it, the person who cuts my hair has to be licensed by the state of South Dakota. Believe me, it did not take 2 years of tech school to cut this, right? It doesn't take a genius, right? Or if someone wants to do someone's nails, that you have to be certified by the state in order to give someone a manicure and to do their nails. I just think it's a shame that when someone wants to start a business, the first thing you have to do is contact a lawyer. And so reducing the obstacles, as much as we all know that there are reasons for some of these obstacles and regulations, but the extent that we can, when someone wants to go into business, just let them go into business. And if they're not licensed, maybe we know that, and maybe I don't want to use an unlicensed hairstylist, so I go to the licensed one and I pay $5 more. I know that's up to me. Just like if you ever had a tree taken down on your house, something most of these guys who do tree work are insured, because if they cut down the tree and it lands on your house, they have insurance to pay for that. Well, some of them are uninsured, but whenever I've done this a couple of times in my life, I've hired a guy to take down a tree. I use the insured guy, and I'm willing to pay more for it, but maybe that should be my choice. But all these regulations on starting a business, or you got to do things this way, or that way, and even agriculture sees some of this too. This gets in the way of people. If someone wants to braid hair, for the love of God, just let them braid hair. And if you want to pay me $20 to braid your hair, just pay me $20, and I don't see why the state of South Dakota, the state of New Jersey needs to intervene in that economic transaction. So that's my 2 cents, which people can take or leave. So.
Well, it's all good points, Professor. And if you think it's bad in South Dakota, come to Jersey.
Yeah, well, yes, I know. It's pretty good here in South Dakota.
No state is more regulated. Yep. And the other aspect of that needs to be considered are all the codes that are required to put up a building, to create a business, all of the different codes that have to be adhered to. And a lot of these codes, a lot of these requirements and regulations are geared towards helping special interests, as opposed to first making the liberty and the accessibility to the creator of the entrepreneurial aspect. The person who's making or creating the business is severely encumbered because of all the different codes and all the different licenses and regulatory restraints that keep that person from being able to afford to go into a business, let alone stay in business once they're in. So you make a great point. And of course,
one of the many pathologies of big government is that big government encourages what in economic nerd talk we call rent seeking. And rent seeking, rent is when you get money without doing anything productive. And so one of the things big government encourages industries to do is instead of making profit because I'm being more productive, right? I'm creating something people want for less price, right? I'm doing something good for less money. is they're encouraged to use the government either to subsidize their industry, or as what you're talking about with codes and regulations, to make it expensive to enter my industry. And so I use regulation to try to make the cost of entering my industry prohibitive to my competitors. So probably I think one of the biggest myths, if not the biggest myth of American politics in our current age, is that big business does not like big government. And it's the exact opposite. Big business likes big government because it increases the cost of entering into various industries. And so big business can afford the accountants, the lawyers, the lobbyists to navigate a complicated regulatory scheme. You see this in spades when we did banking regulation after the 2008, 2009 Dodd-Frank. Well, Barney Frank from New Jersey, correct?
I believe New York.
From New York. Okay, I thought it was Jersey. Okay, from New York. So
Close.
I shouldn't foist him on you. But
please no.
the outcome of Dodd-Frank, this Byzantine banking regulation that was meant to correct the problems that led us into the real estate and economic, the banking collapse of 08, 09, was that after Dodd-Frank, the 5 largest banks in the country have a larger share of our deposits than they did before the crisis, because the biggest banks have the lobbyists, the lawyers, and the accountants that they can negotiate this complex regulatory scheme, where medium and small size banks are like, we're not sure what's legal or what's not legal. We don't have the legal juice. We don't have the lawyers, to negotiate this. And if we run afoul, we can't afford the fine. Whereas the super banks, I guess if we run afoul of this, we'll just pay the fine because we've got the money.
They made it so, Professor, that middle class borrowers, middle class people, middle class entrepreneurs weren't able to borrow money. Because of the restrictions placed on. It was only the big corporations that can borrow money by making a phone call, but not the person who's got to go through the process and have the credit check and do all of his due diligence. And the bank says, well, we just can't do it because of, too many restraints placed upon us.
Let me tell you, I just refinanced my house. Thank you, COVID, and low interest rates. I just refinanced my house. And I tell you, because this was not like when I bought my first house. The paperwork I felt out was literally this thick. It was 200 pages of paperwork. And if anyone who's ever bought a house, this when you got to go to closing and you sign. Oh my gosh, it was just nuts. And I know, some of that is necessary, but I get it, and people want to protect themselves when you're dealing with housing, which it's a lot of money. But a lot of that is because of borrowing regulations that are part of Dodd-Frank, and they're there to try to protect people. What it does though is it makes it really expensive to go through something as simple as a real estate transaction. Becomes more expensive than it otherwise would be, and that's an obstacle to people having, say, the independence of being a homeowner. Is an example of that, when it becomes more expensive to go through the process of buying a house because there are a lot of regulations on it. And I'm not laissez-faire on these things. Banking regulations are important for protections of people, but again, everything is in moderation in my view. And we just got to realize there's a cost and benefit, and that big business, what Madison and Furless 62 calls the clever and sagacious few, they can, as industrious and sagacious few can manipulate complicated government to their own ends.
Right. And the bottom line, Professor of Lincoln was here today. He would say that it would be much, much harder for wage labor to move into the free labor category.
Exactly.
Because of the restrictions and because of which are many of the restrictions, if not all the restrictions, are placed on people by government. And Lincoln would not go for that.
I agree.
Well, anyway, Professor, that was an outstanding chapter And again, let me,
appreciate it.
before we go, I want to put the book up, and I want the people to realize that the price of this book has gone up substantially, Professor.
It was way
People are
below
buying
cover
it.
price, and now they put it back to cover
Yeah.
price. People should have bought this a month ago, and it
now,
was like $20.
Right. So now people need to get out there and get this book.
Yep.
You're going to want to learn about what needs to be done to reform the Republican Party, restore it back into the statesmanship, prudence, moderation, intellect, benevolence of all one Abraham Lincoln, which is what we're calling for. And excuse me, is we certainly appreciate this book, Professor, and I greatly appreciate your time today. I look forward to having you back
We'll do
a
this
month
again.
from today,
You
or a
bet.
month in a month, roughly,
I'm ready.
30 days. We'll talk about the next chapter.
Can do.
Well, thank you very much. And I thank all the audience. Please like and share this video. We'll have it up on YouTube in a little while. But the whole idea, Professor, is you're in the education business. And so are the New Jersey Constitutional Republicans. And we hope that everyone benefits from this. And as we sign off, let's remember, Professor and the audience, what Lincoln said, that the Declaration of Independence provides the impetus. And from behind those very, very important words comes the clear message of liberty for all. Thank you.